Okay, welcome to Changing Minds, the podcast that explores how the latest advances in psychology, behavioral sciences, and neuroscience are being used to address some of those society's most pressing issues. I'm your host, Gorkan Ametoglu. With the increasingly central role of technology in our everyday lives, it isn't difficult to imagine a world where machines and algorithms are taking over a lot of the decisions we make also in business and at work. One area that has been fiercely debated in recent years is the use of algorithms in hiring decisions. So, are machines better at making hiring decisions than humans? And what does science tell us about this debate? With me to discuss these issues is Tomas Chamorro-Premuzic. Tomas is a professor of business psychology at UCL and NYU, the chief talent scientist at Manpower, and an international authority in assessment and selection. Welcome to Changing Minds, Tomas.
Hi, thank you for having me, Gorkan.
All right, so I want to start with asking about your experience, really, of what is happening in the real world in terms of recruitment, in terms of assessment. You have obviously years of experience working with industry on these issues. So what's your view on the current state of play? What's happening on the ground? And perhaps what the role of new tech is?
So look, I think there's no question that organizations are mostly on a quest to become more data-driven and evidence-based in their people issues. I mean, in their management of people. All organizations have realized that most of their problems have to do with people. And if you can't understand people, which usually requires you to predict what they might do or not in the future, then you don't understand them. And so I think that's the zeitgeist, and it's very exciting for any applied psychologist or behavioral scientist who tries to have impact in the real world of business to be alive today. If you look at it in more detail, I think you have three buckets of maturity in the field, in the space. You have organizations who are mostly rightly still doing science-based assessment, recruitment, selection, applying what we know has worked for some time and not that bothered by new innovations. Then you have the AI field, which is a mix of people doing cool stuff in people analytics and others experimenting maybe too much with shiny new objects and fads that are unlikely to work or have, you know, potential ethical and even legal issues and implications. And then the biggest bucket, which is people still rely on their own intuition and their own potential, and they're immune to any data, even if they say that they want to be more evidence-based. The biggest opportunity to improve is to really have leaders who have the humility to distrust their own instincts and allow the science to come in.
Fantastic. I mean, can you give us an example of the three buckets then? So, you know, when you say, okay, there's the biggest bucket, which is intuition based, or the first bucket, like just explain to our audience what you mean by that.
Yeah, you know, and I think the best way to understand it is not by separating between companies, but looking at the representation of these three buckets within the same firm. So, you know, you have big companies like PepsiCo, Unilever, Maersk, Shell, Coca-Cola, Microsoft, Accenture. They have really smart departments of people with PhDs in organizational psychology doing people analytics, who are probably using really good psychometric assessments, structured interviews, and linking that data to performance, right? So, but if you actually look at how often they're doing it, maybe it's just 10, 15% of their workforce that is, penetrated or that is accessed through these methods. Then they might be experimenting in the pre-hire market with things like game-based assessments, so gamification, social media analytics, even algorithms that mine digital or virtual interview data, but that's really scratching the surface at the moment. And actually, the thing that even they will admit if you go there is that a lot of the decisions that are still made internally, particularly whom to promote or whether to evaluate whether someone has potential for a senior leadership role, are still more intuitive than data-driven. You know, they're still based more on the opinions or the preferences that senior interviewers have. So I think there's a really interesting phenomenon that if you look at lower level jobs, unskilled positions where you have a lot of volume, AI and analytics are penetrating and disrupting the field a lot. But if you go to the top of the hierarchy, CEOs, executives, C-suites, senior leaders, it's mostly still going out for lunch or dinner with people. Well, assuming you can do it in the places you are and there's no lockdown. If not, drinks on Zoom, but very little datification. By the way, I was on the phone last week to a big private equity firm that were saying that they are now acquiring companies without even doing Zoom interviews because they don't have time. So they asked me a question I've been asked before: could you leverage AI, analytics, machine learning technologies, natural language processing to mine public records of these entrepreneurs and founders and tell us, whether they have a dark side, whether they're potentially narcissistic, or whether they're good guys and we should keep them. So the potential for disruption is there, but we're still scratching the surface.
Okay, and it's interesting that it's happening on lower levels, but not necessarily on the most important levels. If you could put it like that, I guess. And why do you think that is?
So a couple of things, mostly the more important your job, if you think about it in terms of objective markers of status, like recognition, salary, skills, credentials, etc. So the high prestige occupations actually are very intangible. They're very, the fact that we use the term essential workers for mostly people whose work you can see, as opposed to management consultants who are just symbolic workers and they think of something and sell you a story, tells you what you need to know about this. I mean, the guy from LSE who wrote the book Bullshit Jobs makes a very good point that a lot of the most highly paid or compensated professions, even the people doing those jobs, they don't really know what they're doing. Like, they're so abstract. This means that you cannot really observe or quantify or operationalize what high performance looks like. If you shadowed or sat behind a top CEO or corporate person for the day, you would see them write emails, send emails, think, and make decisions, right? Whereas in low-level jobs, call center operators, customer service jobs, even like salespeople, which is not low level, but you have good outcomes to rank order people of performance, the better your performance data, the better you can train these algorithms and the more effective AI will be. So, it's quite interesting because as you go up the hierarchy of status and prestige, performance becomes more subjective and harder to, see, and easier to fake, of course, which is why it's so interesting in the context of political leadership. Everyone has preferences, but if you ask people, rank order me the top prime ministers or presidents of any country in the last 100 years, people are clueless. They don't look at the performance, achievements, indicators, etc. They just see whether they're charismatic, whether they're fun, entertaining, and it's a matter of opinions. The opposite would happen in the field of sports. Professional sports, as you well know, you have all these quantitative metrics. So you might argue that Messi is better than Ronaldo, but if we look at their performance, they're comparable, and for sure they are, the top two players.
And so, yeah, that's really interesting. And so, but do you think that also means that it's kind of inevitable that that AI and algorithms will be less likely to be used at higher levels of the hierarchy when making decisions? Is it sort of inevitable because it's so difficult to measure performance at those levels, or do you think AI can actually, or new technology can actually infiltrate that market too?
Well, I think we are making progress, and there is potential for improvement. It's never going to be perfect. It's never going to be, well, there's a question whether at the level of neuroscience and brain scanning or even Neuralink, if you get at that level, can you quantify whether someone is making a better decision and correlate that with company profits and, market cap and all of that. Right now, the best thing we can do is to correlate signals from the leaders, let's say, or high status, empowered professionals that have a lot of responsibilities and hold accountabilities for others. So you can correlate whether it is natural language processing, scraped virtual interview data, game scores, or traditional psychometric scores on personality, intelligence, entrepreneurship with how the company does. So that's important because we know that there is a correlation, and people with certain qualities that we can measure, their businesses outperform their competitors. And we also have a theory as to why that is the case. They're more entrepreneurial, they're more strategic, they're more intelligent, or they have more self-control. What you don't really know is all the stuff that is in the middle. So if it's an input-output issue, then you do have limited potential for not just predicting and explaining, but also influencing that. You know, if your best bet, I mean, creativity is a perfect field for that, because you don't really know what creative people are going to do and what they're going to produce. But you know that if you bet on certain people with certain characteristics, creativity is more likely to happen. You know, so we have to be comfortable with that. And I do think that for sure, the biggest opportunity for organizations is to find a way to sanitize and sterilize the performance space, the performance measures. Let's face it, 200 years ago or 100 years ago, it was just sheer nepotism and leaders could get away with murder. I like to hire this person because I don't have to tell you why. And then that's not just unfair and but for diversity, but for the organization. At the opposite end, you have maybe selection that is gender blind, age blind, blind to social class, blind to even university qualifications, and mines all the information from the person's past behavior, their psychometric scores, and even how they do on simulations, etc. And then, you know, you make it similar to blind wine tasting in a way.
Mm-hmm. I mean, so we've talked about I guess the opposite ends, right? But it strikes me that there is a huge middle there in terms of, you know, it's not maybe super difficult to measure performance, but it's not very easy either. I think probably a lot of jobs, if not most, are in the middle somewhere. I mean, I guess the question is, what's the state of play there in terms of new tech, but in terms of also the science that is being applied, and also the opportunities that still lay ahead of us?
I think that, you know, the state of play of new tech that is happening, you know, without going into the kind of too far-fetched futuristic stuff, really involves getting cleaner and more usable data and, you know, combining it or connecting it in real time. And you know, the fundamental difference between people who do this well and those who don't has to do, I think, 50% with the quality and quantity of data, 10% with the actual caliber or quality of the data science, and 40% on whether they act on it or not, right? So let me give you a common example that will be in your middle range, which is if you're an average manager, I can have a lot of data on what you do on an everyday basis or on a weekly basis, including how many emails you send, what words you say on the emails, whether you respond fast or not, now that meetings are on Zoom, whether you let other people speak or not, whether you speak more. Imagine, you know, AI can do this in a very non-intrusive way because it doesn't have a personality or an agenda, and it doesn't care about, you know, whether you're doing, it's just quantifying everything. Then I can connect that data with your team level of engagement, morale, productivity, performance. That's probably as good as it gets. And, you know, the acting part is important because if you're measuring all this, but then you let bad managers stay on the job and continue, or don't confront them and hold them accountable, or you keep promoting people who have low scores because you like them, then let's not expect progress, you know? So it's a little bit like a lot of these innovations are equivalent to having a self-driving car function in your car, but you still have the hands on the wheel and you don't activate it because you feel that you are a more reliable driver. And of course, humans are very good at creating a version of the world that is self-enhancing and compatible with their own delusions. So the trick is, and here's where behavioral science is doing a big sea change in this process, is to have science-like hypothesis testing. You know, if you hire this person, what do you expect? If you implement this technology to hire lots of managers, what change do you expect to see? And then measure impact. And if it doesn't work, revise, right? So someone once said, it's not about reaching perfection, but finding better ways of being wrong and improving incrementally. That's a whole cultural mindset. And I think, you know, companies like Google, Amazon, and the big disruptors in tech are applying this engineering like to their people management. So that's, you know, where we're seeing a lot of progress in HR.
Okay, so I'm going to assume that the industry is something like a normal distribution in terms of their you know, application of, or in terms of what they should be doing, or and how much science they apply. Or I mean, I guess my question is, what is the industry average in terms of doing what you say that can be done with technology and science? If you see what I mean.
Yep.
How far are companies on average to getting where we should be?
Yeah, so, you know, as someone once said, you know, 88% of statistics are made up. So this will be one of them, right? So, I mean, I would say, if you allow me to revise the question slightly, and it's like, what percentage of companies and real world organizations are significantly leveraging what we know that could be done to drive progress? Yeah. I would say is 10 to 15%. So it is a normal distribution, but the bulk and the middle is still really bad, you know. And for every Microsoft, Unilever, Coca-Cola, etc., there's a lot that are here. One of the things that are clear is that technology, including AI, has not really systematically improved our ability to make accurate predictions, but it has decreased the costs and decreased the testing time to sometimes zero. By the way, cost is also sometimes zero. And it has improved the candidate experience a lot. Often the price for all of this is ethics and legal issues, right? But basically, a lot of the times I'm asked by founders or small business owners, hey, I would love to do this, and I read a lot about what you write on your books and HBR, etc. But oh, you know, I only have 100 employees or 200 employees. It doesn't matter. It's the same vendor, the same app, the same process, and you can leverage the same data. So I think that's where we might see more opportunity when younger people start with a data-centric mind and already want to use evidence and data to make better people decisions. They can do it even if there are very few people. Whereas historically, it was very expensive to do it for, you know, assessment centers or assessments and feedback and coach, etc. By the way, the other big opportunity, I think, of the field, and there we're seeing more potential and more adoption, is for these technologies to democratize feedback and let people understand what they're good at, what they're not so good at, and where they need to be coached. Historically, if you were the recipient of any assessment tools, you didn't get feedback. You either got a job or not. Right now, you know, the feedback has been, you know, simplified so much that even if you're not doing anything, you could right now potentially get feedback from algorithms and AIs and apps and tools that have a lot of data on you right now, you know. So I think in the future we might even see Spotify, Netflix, and Amazon tell us whether we're interesting, quirky, creative, boring, based on what we consume, you know. And maybe that information could be transposed to a potential employer, and maybe that data can be traded or swapped in that context.
Yeah, really interesting. I know a contentious issue really is the, you know, when you speak about all of this, obviously, you know, I'm going to assume some people are already thinking about it, is this sort of bias in AI, right? Like how accurate are these tools at telling us who we are, and you know, how much bias is there in AI, and can AI harm rather than do good, especially when it comes to assessment and hiring people or giving us feedback? What's your view on that?
Well, so, AI is just a technology, and in the context of HR and talent, it's really mostly machine learning, sometimes with deep learning or neural networks, but you can imagine it as a very fancy and fast, super powerful set of correlations that finds patterns in a data. It's a prediction machine. So when this happens, this is more likely to happen, and that's it. To be sure, AI doesn't have a moral code. It's not ethical or unethical. It doesn't have a personality. It doesn't have a fragile self-esteem that it needs to protect by bringing people down because they are Black, Hispanic, female, or old. And it is also true that AI is mostly following algorithms. Algorithms are a recipe, and those recipes are still mostly designed with some human input. But when people say, well, surely AI is biased because the programmers are biased, that is incorrect. To think that some white bros in Silicon Valley with a hoodie are evil and trying to manipulate the world into being narrow-minded, that is not the issue. The issue is that when you have a training set for your data and you train algorithms to predict something that is happening in the real world, it will absorb, emulate, and even augment the bias that is there. I think the simplest example would be the algorithms that Microsoft and Amazon tried to deploy to predict who gets promoted. So a chatbot that was scraping CV data or interactions on social media and ended up recommending mostly middle-aged, white, male engineers for a job. Accurately so, by the way, because that's the profile of people who typically gets promoted in those companies. So people were scandalized and say, oh my God, AI is racist or sexist, when in fact, it was correctly predicting sexist and racist preferences. So the bottom line is that we don't need for AI or technology to introduce bias to the world. Humans are very good at that. And if we're comfortable with the fact that it's never going to be perfect, but it might be less biased than human preferences, then I think the world will become not just more efficient, but also more meritocratic and fair, right? I remember the Wall Street Journal last year had an article saying, be careful, a face scraping algorithm might decide whether you get your new job or not. And my reaction was like, they mean the human brain? Because that's what's been happening for, millennia. Somebody looks at you and decide whether you get a job or not. And by the way, even if you're a well-meaning and ethical human and you hire someone correctly or not, I have no way of knowing why you hired that person. You have no way of knowing. You might think that it's because they were charming or smart or said the right things, but maybe you like the way they smelled. Maybe, they were wearing a football shirt that you liked, and maybe the caffeine kicked in at that very moment and triggered that decision. Whereas with AI, you can always reverse engineer the algorithm and correct it. This is like the number one thing, whereas a human mind, you can't reverse engineer it, correct it, or send people to unconscious bias training, hoping that they will become Mother Teresa, who, by the way, also had her biases.
Yeah, fantastic. This is a point which also sort of makes me think about something you said earlier. So if we think about accepting that, this whole issue of algorithms have biases and accepting potentially that they might have less biases than humans, I think it sort of links back to what you said earlier about potentially, at least, only about 10 to 15% of companies are leveraging the science and technology in the way that they could be. I'm wondering why are we still lagging behind in a way with applying the science and the technology?
Well, first, let's understand that the science practice gap is not unusual or unfamiliar to any sciences. I mean, right now, all over the world, you have visible signs of the science practice gap in medicine, with people still saying, some heads of state using alternative medicine for now the COVID kind of a virus. And I think the average kind of a time of adoption for even mainstream medicines that go through proper trials, etc., is very long and the majority of people ignore it. So if you have it in situations that, you know, are life-threatening, I mean, you can imagine in an area like psychology or behavioral science, where unlike in medicine or nuclear physics or astrophysics, most people feel that they actually know, you know, they don't think that they have to have a PhD in behavioral science or psychology to understand people. They're like, I work with people all the time, so I know, you know, I know talent when I see it, and I know if somebody has potential. And then of course, confirmation bias is so pervasive that you can always find evidence that you were right and ignore evidence that you were wrong, you know, or at least pretend that that is the case to others. So I think bottom line is people feel they have intuition where they don't. They trust their expertise even when they don't have some. There are, of course, misconceptions about AI, and people are rightly worried about misuses. That, by the way, AI is a technology, so it can be used for good or bad purposes. And I think the final one is that in any area of science, you know, we should blame ourselves as academics and scientists, because we often speak just to ourselves and publish in very small, obscure journals. And we have this snobby attitude that, you know, our work is so good that people will follow and don't reach out to the wider community. That's why things like, you know, this webinar or session and other platforms that enable us to connect to actual users are critical, because if we can persuade them that this can help them, then we're not going to drive progress. You know, just because you have a great idea doesn't mean other people will believe you.
Yeah, that's really great. So that makes me think that there's not only an opportunity to bridge the science gap for industry, but actually an opportunity for scientists to help bridge that gap, right? An opportunity and potentially, would you say potentially an obligation to some extent as well?
I think there is an obligation, and I think impact happens through work, organizations, and institutions. But let's not forget that ultimately it's seen at the national or societal level, because today those societies that are winning the war for talent and creating more successful organizations and basically have higher levels of GDP, PPP, and all whatever you want, they have a richer history over the last 5 or 6 decades of being more evidence-based and fighting nepotism and corruption and politics. You know, I mean, corruption happens for various reasons, but one of the key characteristics is that typically the best person doesn't get the job, and the best or most talented individuals are, you know, undermined or overlooked in favor of people who are just part of the establishment. You know, so, and I mean, you know, in a way, that is the lesson. And that's maybe one of the reasons why a lot of people don't want to adopt things that would be good for them, because it takes a long time to see the rewards. You know, it takes a long time to, and maybe if you're only trying to improve your own career success, you don't care that in 40 years you're going to drive progress. But that's what true leadership is about. And, you know, I think this should be the main lesson, you know, that we can use science to improve individuals' own career prospects, but also societies as a whole.
All right. That's a fascinating discussion, and I'm sure we could have gone on for quite a bit more, but I think we've run out of time. So I'd like to thank you a lot, Tomas. So thanks everyone also for listening. You can access all the previous episodes on the UCL Changing Minds website. Thanks again for watching, and see you next time.